Hello, Dr. Shiraz. Thank you for joining us today. So I wanted to start with asking about your journey. So you started at IBA, and then you did your master's at Harvard, and then your PhD at Berkeley, and now you're faculty at Brown. So could you talk a little bit about that journey and how you went from where you started to where you are now?
Okay. Well, firstly, thank you all for being patient, and Dr. Azam especially for inviting me, and you both for preparing. And I know you're interested. You might be disappointed, but we'll see where it goes. These are open-ended conversations. Sometimes you speak to Ivy League background people. Sometimes it's helpful. Sometimes it's not helpful at all. So I'll try to talk about that later on a bit. As for myself, well, I was just like you at IBA or elsewhere. I sat in these rooms, walked these halls and the foyer and other spaces in IBA, and I tried to, think openly about myself and what I want to do. When I joined IBA, my plan was to do finance. I was doing ACCA, so the idea was to combine, a major in finance with that. So it was a very typical, pathway before me, and great thing about IBA was that you could actually explore different courses. So exactly the time when I joined, there was more offering, and under the rubric of liberal arts. So I was able to explore different subject areas. That's sort of how it began. The other thing that really helped was during that journey at IBA was talking to different professors, you know, uh, people at other universities or outside who had gone through similar processes in discovering their own interests. Um, and I think later on we can unpack it a bit further, but just to kind of complete the broader picture, towards the end of I would say by my third year, I had some idea that I wanted to do the humanities, and I had some vague interest between history, religion, philosophy, literature. And so I had a growing interest in history of science. There was some really good courses being offered in that area at IB at that time. And so, I decided to apply in programs where I could study the history of Arabic sciences and philosophy. Um, and then I went to Harvard for a 2-year program in religion. That's one broad area under which you can explore different fields, the kind that I was interested in. Um, and then I eventually ended up at Berkeley to do my PhD, and I finished in May. And I specialized in Islamic intellectual history, so it's a broader area. So I do study history of science, but I also do look at its intersection with philosophy, with law, with rhetoric, um, and other things that I'm interested in more recently. So that's sort of the broad picture, but I'm happy to unpack it further depending on your questions.
Um, so when you started your applications, you said like after IBA you went to Harvard. So like every single student who applies to an Ivy League, you wrote a statement of purpose. What is it that you think your statement of purpose included that helped you get into Harvard? And what are some mistakes that students do, which is why they get rejected?
Okay, firstly, disclaimer, you can never find out what actually works in the statement unless you have access to the committee that looks at the statement. I have never met those people. But I think what works, my gut feeling is that, especially at master's level and then PhD more so, what they're looking for is, of course, your interest in the field. But I think more than interest, they want you to be able to locate yourself in that field. So you should be able to identify some sub area, right? You should be able to identify some problems or issues in that field. And then where you want to place yourself, right? What kind of arguments you're interested in, what sort of literature you have read. You cannot go on and on talking about it in detail, but you should be able to put it together into a sort of a neat narrative where you're talking about yourself, but you're also kind of projecting yourself into that field. So, and what that requires, of course, is that you have to read up and talk to people about that particular area that you're applying for.
So the problem that a lot of students face when they're writing their SOP is that they try to write things that they think that admission officers want them to write rather than what they actually want to write about. So what would your advice be to students who think like that?
Well, I mean, depends what these advisors or counselors have to offer. Maybe it depends on the specific advice. It can be helpful. So I don't want you to overlook that just because it's coming from a counselor. But one problem with just going by a generic advice is that you might end up producing some statement that looks like hundred or thousands of other statements. So you have to really stand out, right? I know it's a cliche, but you really have to make the effort. Uh, and so that's sort of the pitfall of just going by a formula. So let's say you have let's say 5 or 7 steps to do it that your counselor or whoever is guiding you offers for writing the statement. Try to sort of play with it. Try to sort of move around the steps or introduce some steps or some components. The point is to still kind of not restrict yourself to those rules, but to produce something that will stand out before the committee.
So you mentioned that you were on, like while you were doing your BBA, you were on a path towards finance. So how did you decide that you wanted to change that? What was there a moment where you decided that I want to transition into something different? How did that go?
Okay. Now I'll try to share a story because I know these are very generic responses that I'm offering, so we'll try to make it more interesting. But sort of the broader idea that I want to convey is that it's never one moment, it's an accumulation of moments that sort of culminate into that change. So one such moment I can share with you that used to happen every week. I used to take a class with Dr. Azam. It was something he hasn't offered, he told me, in quite a while. It was a class on financial institutions and markets. And I distinctly remember that I used to love that class. I really enjoyed it. And then there was this another class that was offered in the Upwa building at that time. I don't know if it's still, they offer classes there anymore or not. It was on financial risk. And I hated that class. It was really boring. So it was a conundrum for me. Why is it that this one finance class I really like, but this other one I don't at all, right? Do I like it or not? Or is it just about the person who's teaching it? It was about the person who was teaching it, Dr. Azam, but it was really about how he was teaching it. The reason I was enjoying this financial institutions class is because he was, among other things, he was also taking a historical approach. So we were looking at how different financial institutions have emerged and evolved, how certain economic, political conditions give rise to certain financial instruments. So what I was implicitly enjoying, I didn't have an explicit idea, but I was sort of tacitly enjoying how we were thinking about financial objects, instruments, and institutions. And so it took me a while to understand what was it that I was really enjoying. It wasn't really finance, that was sort of more of an excuse. It was historical thinking that was behind how the professor was teaching it. And of course, this other class on financial risk wasn't at all about that. It could have been. One can teach something on financial risk using a historical approach, but that professor didn't really adopt that approach. And so the broader takeaway is that even as you have the same course being offered by different professors, there are different approaches that they will be adopting, right? There are different methods through which they'll be teaching. So it really boils down to who you're studying with. And my sort of motto nowadays is that we like to think that there are these impersonal institutions like IBA or Harvard's or these Ivy Leagues that we were just talking about. We like to think that these are these factories that produce certain kinds of people. I think that's a fallacy. I feel that it's still people, instructors who are the institutions, in the sense that they are the organizing principle of learning. And whether you're at IBA or at some Ivy League or not, what it will really boil down to is who you're studying with. For me, that was the case. So coming back to your question, I said it was an accumulation of moments. It was moments with professors like Dr. Azam or Dr. Akbar Zaidi, who was teaching Pakistan history. It was Dr. Numanul Haq, who was teaching history of science. It was Alia Naqvi, who was teaching Mughal history, and certain other professors who were teaching courses in adjacent areas that was, for me, one way or the other, a way of realizing what I was really interested in. And one thing I'll just add to conclude is that I think you have to always proceed. You don't just run into what you like. You only identify things that you're already anticipating, right? So it's what really guides you is a healthy skepticism. So you have to constantly question yourself. What is it that you're really liking? For going back to the example I shared earlier, that I had to really be skeptical and think, why is it that this one finance class I like, but the other one I don't? So you have to constantly kind of engage in a dialogue with yourself and with your peers and with your professors as well.
So while we're on the topic of professors, you had some amazing professors that helped you navigate your way, and I'm sure provided you stellar recommendation letters. So recommendation letters are probably more important than we give them credit for. So how do you think, what's the process of basically, getting a recommendation letter? How sooner than the application should students actually start approaching professors, and who are the type of professors that they should be approaching?
Of course, it boils down to the field that you're applying in, and the level you're applying for. So, for example, for masters, there's more latitude, so you can have one person who's exactly in the field that you're applying, two people that you've worked with or studied some other subject with. But at PhD level, there's less latitude, so yes, you need at least two people, and ideally all three. Let's say if you have three letter options, all three in the same field. I think you should give your referees more time to think about what they're doing. There are different approaches, so it again really depends on the letter writer. Sometimes they write very quickly, they don't ask you many questions. Sometimes a professor would have questions about what you want to do, and they would really want to mention that in the letter. So again, it's not a cookie cutter sort of approach. You'll have to approach different people differently. But yeah, I think as a rule of thumb, give them enough time, ask them beforehand. One thing that I will add is that sometimes we, generally as a culture, we tend to sort of hesitate knocking on people's doors. But I've always felt that is really one big difference. So just because there are moments with colleagues of mine who decided to apply for an MPA degree or an MBA degree much later, and they asked me, do you think I can still write to Dr. Azam and ask him for a letter, or Dr. Luman or whatever? And they'll question themselves that whether they'll get the response or not, because so much time has passed. But it's just a hesitation in your mind. You should always write to people, and they remember you even if they don't. You can have a meeting, you can have a quick chat, and most people are willing to help, I think.
And just going back to your previous answer a little bit, what would you say about the importance of mentors in your life? So have you had any important mentors, and like any notable piece of advice that they've shared with you that stuck with you?
Yes, I think that's another major component of what we're discussing today, mentors. Of course, not all professors end up becoming your mentors. Only some do. And I mean, there is also a culture of forcing mentorship, which doesn't necessarily help. Of course, institutions like IBA sometimes want there to be a mentor, but it's always helpful to find a mentor naturally, based on your conversation and interests. So you should also be, even as, let's say, you have some mentor or advisor assigned, you should also be looking for other professors who, you're enjoying their lectures, so you speak to them. As for myself, my experience with mentors is, I would say, really instrumental, because they are the people who really tell you whether you can pursue a path or not, and what sort of hurdles you need to overcome. One thing that I did learn along the way was that there's no one mentor for all your troubles in life. So there'll be different mentors for different kinds of things. So I'll give you a concrete example. When I was here, one of the professors here was Framji Minwala, and he had quite extensive experience in American academia. And he was instrumental in making me realize that even as I've been studying finance, I can switch to the humanities, right? And my conversations with him about this particular challenge were really helpful. Now, he was the right person for that, that kind of counseling, right? But let's say whether I should study Islamic philosophy and law, not really, right? Similarly, Dr. Lomanul Haq was specifically sort of, very helpful for me when it came to the subject matter that I was interested in, right? And so, yeah, it really boils down to different kinds of people, different areas of expertise they have. So you should, again, this is another way of not boxing yourself in one with one kind of advice. And between different people, as you're hearing different kinds of advice, you may not always agree with them, but you'll probably find yourself somewhere in the middle. So again, it sort of just helps with this process of dialogue with yourself, as I mentioned earlier, having those mentors. So yeah, try to find natural mentors. It really helped me. I think it was not part of the formal curriculum, but there's something that in academia we call hidden curriculum. It's everything you have to do that's not mentioned in the nisab, right? And that's certainly one part of it, right?
So a lot of students here, they think of grad school as like a goal. It's it's something that gives them meaning and a sense of purpose while they are at university for these 4 years. You have already reached that stage. You have actually crossed it. You found that meaning that most of these students actually look for. And so how do you continue to find meaning in life after you have achieved that? Do you think that after achieving what you wanted to achieve, it killed your ambition?
Okay, that's a very loaded question. But there are interesting elements there. No, I wouldn't say it killed my ambition, because my ambition was never to do grad school. I mean, that was part of it, right? That was sort of the means to that end. The final destination is not something that's always super clear, but one has sort of a vague understanding. What I ideally wanted to do is do research and do teaching in this area that I'm interested in. So I still have to work towards that, right? To find some type of permanency. So the journey is far from over, right? In fact, we could say that there are fewer paths back. So I have to just kind of keep marching on. So yeah, I think you continue to sort of have meaning. But an important element in your question, which I want to address, is the thing about goals is I think it's important to kind of differentiate these short-term goals or the means from vision, or what is it that you're really desiring in life, right? And that should be broad enough and abstract enough to continue to hold on to. If the goal in your life is to go to Harvard, trust me, 1 year into it, you'll find a way to be disappointed. And so what do you do then, right? So even there, you'll have to, again, think about being in the Ivy League in a healthy way in terms of some higher goal, some value that you're striving for, which gives you meaning, right? So yeah, I would say that about myself. That's certainly what I'm trying to do. That higher value, something that I'm still chasing, as I was 15 years ago here, but keeps kind of evolving. You keep getting better vision of it. But yeah, that's what keeps giving you meaning. If the goal is too limited, and you could be stuck by just the possibility of achieving it, what do you do then? So again, for that reason, it's important to keep kind of questioning and thinking about what you're doing and what your purpose is. We always have some gut feeling about what's driving it, and it takes a long time to be able to express it. So yeah.
So it's better, you think that the journey is more important than the destination that we supposedly want?
Yeah, that's again a cliche, but you realize that the journey is more important. I think the destination is also important. Certainly, you must have a sense of direction. But yeah, maybe it's true that once you meet those short-term goals, like you finish your MA degree or your PhD, you also realize that there's still more to do in terms of final destination. And you realize that it was really the various phases that you went through, the different pathways that you adopted. They were really helpful in shaping you, making your life meaningful. And of course, you grow so much as a person. You learn so much about your own instincts, your likes and dislikes. You make friends, and along the way. So your life also keeps going, and so it's important to keep that in mind.
Did you always know that you wanted to go into academia and that you wanted to teach?
Sorry?
Did you always know that you wanted to go into academia and that you wanted to teach?
No, I didn't realize that until I came to the IBA and I saw people who were in academia. I didn't know that clearly. I would say as a teenager, I had, as most of us do, some vague interest in arts and religion or literature. I had no idea that this is something you could take up as a serious pursuit. So it's something that happened in college. And that's perhaps why it's important to not box yourself, to actually put yourself out there and try different things when you're in college. Yeah.
Okay. And one thing that fascinates me about being in academia is that you have to do a lot of research. And so how did you know that this is what you wanted to specialize in? How did you come across that?
That's a great question. So, footnotes. What do I mean by that? So, when you're reading, let's say you take a class on hadith, let's say, right, history of hadith, or let's say history of Islamic philosophy, and your professors will assign you some readings, right? And as you're reading, sometimes you'll find it boring, sometimes you'll find it interesting, and when you find it interesting, you'll try to probe it further, right? So you look up, let's say, footnotes, where oftentimes what the root of the disagreement is around a particular issue in a field, that will become more evident, right? Where citations are and glosses and commentaries are in various academic writings. And that's where sort of to say that footnotes is where you find it is sort of a metaphorical way of saying that you have to dig deeper, right? And so, you have to read deeply and you have to read sort of strategically. And then you'll come back to class, you'll ask your professor certain questions about what you've read and the problems that you're interested in. So it's about finding some set of problems in a field, right? And this is, I keep going back, repeating the word problems in a field. That's what really knowledge boils down to, right? Even if you think about it from a design perspective that you've been doing on here, that any discipline at its edges or where you do research is really about certain debates and problems that people are trying to solve. Pick any field in the world, right? Whether it's history or engineering or whatever. So where you discover that is through reading and listening and digging deeper. So you use reading as a gateway and kind of dig in deeper into certain problems that resonate with you. And you feel like you want to be the kind of person who want to answer these questions. So that's sort of one way of doing it. That's certainly how I did it. That's how I, for example, learned that there are certain scholars who are writing on this subject. There are certain set of books that have come out recently, certain canonical articles in this area. And so you learn a canon, both a canon of authors, a canon of problems, at least in academia, that's how you do it, right? So again, college is the time, these courses give you the time to do that.
So I wanted to follow up on that. You did your research on 17th century Mughal South Asia. It's something that you did. So because of how ancient the topic itself is, how do you continue to make something so old, something so relevant and so valid in today's time?
Okay. Indirectly, the question is about these historical studies that we do. How are they relevant today? And specifically, what is it about 17th century South Asia? Generally, historical topics tend to be, we are told that we shouldn't be pursuing historical research purely from the perspective of the present because it blinds us to what's unique about the past. But when you do enough research, you realize, and when you write about it, you talk about it, you realize that there are indirect ways in which it's relevant. So for example, a couple of broad things that I'll just touch on very briefly. For example, you learn that it's a world in which knowledge is organized very differently than ours. And we tend to value that past. I mean, symbolically, we still think about that history of this region as a certain moment which was formative or not. Some people would argue that it was a period of decline because it was some type of, imperial system. Some would argue that it was, too Islamic. Some would say it was not Islamic enough. But either way, I think what you will learn is that the ways in which that world is complex tends to question our own understanding of the present. And what I mean by that is, for example, when I look at 17th century, so let's go back to that question. What I realize is that the way people are producing philosophy in that world, or science, or what we call science today, is more organized around people than around books. By people, I mean experts in those fields. Now, the kind of texts that we have from that period, they tend to represent a very different culture of reading, a very different way of cultivating critical thinking. Now, today, we are interested in critical thinking, right? I was talking about reading earlier. When we look at the past, I think we encounter these strange ways in which people are achieving goals that are a bit similar to ours. For example, like cultivating deep reading habits, critical thinking, expanding different fields, preserving knowledge, transmitting it, but they're doing it in a very different way, right? And in moments like the present, when the current knowledge economy is changing, today we are not reading in the same way as we were 20 years ago. There's a lot of debate about what it means to read today, for example. I think thinking about the past as a parallel, as an alien world in which people were still achieving critical thinking habits through different means, it offers us insights about how we can move forward. Right? And so that's the broader answer I'll give. But it's a big topic, and much can be debated in terms of details. But all my sort of point in a nutshell is that it's an alternate way of thinking about values that matter to us even today, and those alternate ways can disrupt our present day thinking in helpful directions.
Okay. So, being in academia and at all of these prestigious institutions, you are naturally surrounded by very accomplished people. So do you ever face imposter syndrome? Or if you do, how do you deal with it?
Yeah, you do. I think imposter syndrome. I mean, the thing about it is that, do you guys know what it is? Yeah. Does somebody want to explain it in 15 seconds?
I'm not sure if I'm qualified to do that.
So you feel a constant self-doubt
Yeah.
when you are surrounded by people that you think are more accomplished than you.
Yeah. So I'll just pick, that's perfect. So I'll just pick one word from there, constant. So it depends on how constant it is. I mean, if you just cannot overcome it, then there's something wrong. Then you have to really think about, your place in that area seriously. But if it keeps coming and going, let's say, for example, when I feel imposter syndrome, I go back and read something that I wrote, and I feel like, okay, it's not so bad. Maybe I'm doing something right? And so it's something that you kind of constantly struggle with, and so long as you keep overcoming it, it's fine. I think it's a natural feeling to have. And yes, as you said, it's symptomatic of being around accomplished people. But there are different kinds of accomplished people, right? So there are those who are actually not that accomplished, who would make you feel like you shouldn't be there. And there'll be people who are insanely successful and extremely accomplished, and they'll make you feel very comfortable in that space. So, in fact, being around those kinds of accomplished people can make you overconfident, right? And so there's also the other extreme. So yeah, but it's part of it. It's sort of part of the process. It's sort of a psychological challenge that you have to take on.
So my question now is a bit different from the conversation we're currently having. But in countries like Pakistan, there is sort of a very specific approach towards achieving religious knowledge. So when you went to Harvard Divinity School, a school that was initially meant for Christian ministers, how do you how did you feel like you fit in over there?
Yeah.
And did you feel like the education you could have received in countries like Pakistan for religious knowledge could have been different to the one you received there?
Yeah. So one interesting fact before I respond to what you're saying. So when I went there, interestingly, so yes, so Harvard Divinity School, like many other schools of religion in America, was set up for Christian ministers and training preachers and offering sort of that kind of formal affiliation in religious knowledge and training and counseling. And it's really difficult to find a counterpart to that in the Islamic tradition. So when I went there, there was interestingly a debate going on at the Divinity School about whether there should be an Islamic counterpart to that or not. And as you can imagine, there was a divide. Some people thought that it's conceptually impossible to imagine sort of a church-like thing in Islam. Some people thought that, well, we can adapt it in certain ways. But what I learned, and just building off of that, is that ultimately it's an academic space. So they've developed, religion is an academic field. It emerged through biblical studies as it evolved during the Enlightenment in the form of comparative religion. And it's a field that has had its baggage, like Oriental studies, but has evolved over time. So, when you go into a program in religion, it's an academic space, right? And which means that there's supposedly an independent criteria of judgment. And so you have to speak from a position of reason and rationality. And so you can feel comfortable in that space. Of course, there's always biases and skew. You shouldn't romanticize it too much. But the point is that there is tolerance towards disagreement, enough so that you can voice your opinion, so long as it's reasoned. And so yeah, you can certainly feel comfortable in such spaces because they're academic. And the other element is that religion as a field of study religious studies is an interdisciplinary field. So people do anthropology, people do art history, people do history of law and all kinds of things in tandem with the study of religion. It's not an isolated discipline. So that's that's precisely what makes it academic, but also diverse enough to for people with different point of views to feel comfortable.
Okay, so thank you to our hosts. So do you guys feel that their Bahadri and showing up here and doing this for the first time has paid off for them? Yes. Yeah? Well, thank you and very well done. Now we're going to give all of you a chance to practice. So maybe something that was said got your attention, you want to know more, right? So when you're having a conversation with somebody like this, you listen, you get curious about certain things, and then you kind of feed that into the conversation. So let's hear some questions from all of you. Yeah?
Of Amna's question earlier. So when you came to IBA, you mentioned that you were doing ACCA and you wanted to combine it with a finance degree. And when you came across religious studies and you wanted to pursue more towards religious history, how did that feeling of, did you have any doubts when changing your vision entirely, since we talked about vision having a goal in itself might be a much narrower narrative arc, but then having a vision is something that you essentially can fit a lot of things inside and can take it throughout your life and not just limit it to your PhD or later in your career as well. So my question is, when you come across a lot of interests or a lot of things that basically you come across maybe during your bachelor's or something, how do you combine it and form a vision? Or a lot of the times as students, when we're going through our bachelor's, we form our identity through that one certain thing that we're focusing on. And then kind of like pivoting from that, what advice would you have for students who are currently going through that or want to do so within their postgrad afterwards?
Yes, so I mean, we can unpack this, what I was saying earlier a bit further in relation to your question about how you have to engage in healthy skepticism. So you have to keep asking yourself questions about what is it that you're really interested in. You might be attracted by the surface of a course, but you realize that it's really not finance, but history that you're interested in. And maybe you're also along the way, let's expand that example, and you're also, let's say, enjoying a class on poetry and poetics. So maybe there's also something about language that interests you, right? Now, you have to be able to kind of hold on to different interests together, even if they're not gelling immediately. But you must have some faith that, eventually they will come together in complementary ways. You cannot force different interests, but I think it's important to hold them long enough to see where to discover that meeting point, right? So you need to have some faith in that process of discovery. Now, that being said, I should add that we also have, and Dr. Azam and I were discussing this the other day, we also have constraints in life, right? Certain responsibilities. And so you have to also balance it with those constraints, which doesn't necessarily mean that you give up on, experimenting with your interests, but maybe you can find more, creative, more smart ways of continuing to pursue that interest, exploring it further. But yeah, all of it coming together into that sort of neat vision, there's no formula for that. It sort of happens, so far as I know, it just happens automatically, but you have to kind of be a bit idealistic, hold on to multiple interests as they're evolving, as they're revealing themselves. And certain interests you will drop, right? You'll realize that was something else and that you were confusing it for. So, yeah, I know it's not an easy sort of answer and I don't have a formula, but it's sort of just a certain approach of continuing to discover, questioning, and being prepared to take the risk, right? So faith is sort of the answer.